let's turn to our final story of the evening. We want to talk about, well, a number of different things, but primarily the many ways that the Pentagon and the military war machine here in the United States is just destroying the earth. So we are very, very honored to be joined by Abby Martin, journalist and host of the Empire Files. Abby, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much for having me, you guys.
Anytime. And I know many of our fans follow the Empire Files, so some people probably know you were recently at RIMPAC. I know it's a big military, exercise or whatever they call those things these days. But maybe you can certainly tell me more about what RIMPAC is and what took you there to observe this bacchanal there from the U.S. military.
Well, it's all part of our reporting on Earth's Greatest Enemy. This is a film about the environmental impact of the U.S. military. I think a lot of us agree that environmental collapse and climate change are the biggest threats facing not only our species, but a lot of life on Earth. A lot of scientists on the issue of climate change are very conservative in their estimates because they don't want to be seen as political. So even the most conservative estimates are pretty dire here. But there's a huge gap in the discussion of the environmental movement that links the U.S. military as the world's largest institutional polluter, the world's largest consumer of fossil fuels. And it's such a huge, broad topic that encompasses so many facets. I mean, Superfund sites of toxic dumping, burn pits, chemical runoff, just the environmental destruction of warfare, and obviously bases, the existence of nearly 1,000 bases around the world. So it's a lot. And RIMPAC fits into this because it's the largest war games in the world, overseen by the United States military, that conducts these exercises with 25 other countries. And every 2 years, they're conducted off the coast of Hawaii, already a very militarized place, heavily occupied by the U.S. military, environmentally, destroyed pretty much, hundreds of toxic sites, several Superfund sites. So it already is kind of putting salt in the wound to even host these off the coast of what Hawaiians consider as like a legally occupied land in itself. But basically, U.S. naval officials claim that these massive war games that are all about, enforcing an international rules-based order, which I find really fascinating considering the allies that are involved in this, including Israel, which is like, why on earth is Israel participating in these war games?
Right.
Basically, it's just power projection, right? It's just basically asserting that the United States, as well as all of these other kind of colonial powers, own this huge region of the world. And this year was the largest year. It kind of scaled back during COVID, and it had 25,000 military personnel from all over the world, and just dozens and dozens of these assault ships, submarines, helicopters, and they use live ammunition, missiles, bombs, and I can go on and on about how destructive these are to the environment, but that is why we went to cover them, because there's so little coverage that is critical about what they are doing over there.
Yeah, I mean, Abby, I was listening to, you did an episode about this, and I was listening to part of it, and it was interesting just the access you got and also the way you were treated, which I know is going to be, featured in your film. I'm looking forward to seeing what that looks like. I know you also got to ask a question to the Secretary of the Navy, so I'm excited to see what that looked like. You've been asking lots of cool questions to very important people recently and doing quite a good job at that. But I wanted to ask about the sort of geopolitical context here, because, as it was framed, this is not directed at any country, but Empire Files released this footage you guys got of these sort of I don't know if it was a mock operation in a mock village taking place, but in that there seemed to be soldiers going into a house that had pictures of Kim Jong-un. So clearly this was, directed at North Korea. But on top of that, this is also as a part of a very anti-China coalition. I mean, the fact that it was taking place in the Pacific, I think, is very symbolic. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about the geopolitical context here? Was China discussed? Was the sort of anti-China alliance and this escalation of Cold War against China present in the war games as far as you saw?
Yeah, first I want to address your first point because it's really interesting in terms of geopolitical forces because, I was one of the only I was the only critical journalist there. There was very little people there covering the largest war games in the world, and the only other U.S. reporters there were kind of stenographers for the military-industrial complex. So reporters for Defense One, covering how cool the systems and tech was of these ships and operations. And then the other half of the contingent of press were Taiwanese media. And so they were very, very insistent on currying favor with Taiwan, letting in Taiwanese media. Taiwan has been invited for the first time in the NDAA, actually. Congress extended the invitation for Taiwan to participate in RIMPAC. China amazingly did participate in 2014 and 2016 only because the United States wanted them to stop militarizing the South China Sea. And then they basically realized it was better to just kind of block them off and just to position, this kind of imperialist bloc against China. So as we saw the Asia pivot reinforced, of course, especially exacerbated during the Trump administration, that's when we saw China become the main focal point here for these war games. Of course, officials will say over and over again, no, this isn't about any one country. But admirals will, go off the record or go off the cuff rather at many press conferences and basically admit that all of this is simulating and posturing toward China's aggressive maneuvers that they're going to take Taiwan in the next 10 years. So all of this is basically mock, drills and operations to prevent that happening. And as you mentioned, very importantly, so North Korea is also involved in this as well. There was mock invasions of residential neighborhoods with pictures of DPRK leaders on the walls. And again, this is 25 countries that are training to invade residential neighborhoods in North Korea. And I would just beg people to really think about that mental exercise. If North Korea, North Korea does prepare against a U.S. invasion of its country for obvious reasons. But imagine if North Korea was working with all of Asia to do like mock invasions of residential neighborhoods in DC with pictures of the founding fathers on the walls. It's just beyond the pale. I mean, it's beyond comprehension because it just simply wouldn't happen. So the fact that this is all posturing against China, I think really says a lot. And, just this international rules-based order and to deter against military expansionism, it's just such projection. Who is the expansionist force in the Pacific? Who is enforcing an international rules-based order and who is violating flagrantly all of the rules and norms around the world? It's the United States and its allies.
No, it's a good point. It's
question.
almost like you're through the looking glass, quite frankly, when you're thinking about, that's really unbelievable. When you guys released the video, I just thought, it's like in a way you're like, oh man, I guess I'm not surprised that they're training against North Korea, but you're just like, you got to be kidding me right now. Especially when they always say, well, we don't want to have any sort of war with North Korea. They're just a bunch of crazy people with nuclear weapons. And it's like, oh, okay. But, you mentioned this a little bit in when you were setting the scene for us, Abby, that I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about, which is, the impact of these war games, the environmental impact. I know a lot of people, I first learned about this from Empire Files, have heard about Red Hill recently and the impact the military had there in terms of, the environmental situation. But, what is this, having these happen year after year after year, really what is the impact on the Hawaiian people and the Hawaiian Islands?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Eugene. And it's something that's so unquantifiable because no one can speak for the creatures in the ocean that are gravely impacted by these war games. On top of the obvious impacts of just leaching chemicals, pollution from these ships, emissions from all of these assault vehicles and subs and helicopters, all of that, there's exemptions for the military, as we know, not only with climate and environmental protections, but also exemptions to go into protected waters that are protected from other commercial boats from traveling into. So this encompasses all across the Pacific Ocean that the military can just go and conduct these operations in these waters. They're protected for a reason, right? Interestingly enough, through my research, I found that so this is the 28th year that RIMPAC has been happening. Up until 2013, the U.S. Navy was basically not only exempt from the Mammal Protection Act, whales, dolphins, sea otters, things like that. But they were also saying that during these exercises, they could take, which really means harm or kill, 25,000 protected marine mammals
Jesus.
for these exercises. And I'm pretty sure that they meant every single time that they were conducted. Now think about how insane that is. I mean, 25,000 marine mammals in the ocean, 25,000. When you're talking about harming or killing them, if you harm them by practicing this high intensity sonar blasts, that is killing them. I mean, when you are preventing these animals from being able to communicate, from migrating, from mating, that is essentially killing them and preventing them from being able to live. So it is astounding. That number is absolutely shocking. They've been exempt ever since. There was a couple lawsuits against them that they said that they were using low intensity sonar blasts. We still cannot quantify how much of an impact that is happening, and how impactful that is to miles and miles. I mean, the Navy basically claims that they have like a scout on top where they're like, oh nope, whale ahoy, like don't fire this giant missile and like sink the ship, which they do. Also, they sink these giant ships every time that they conduct RIMPAC, which crush coral reefs and do all these things. But it's like, dude, that does not, like, you're not accounting for hundreds of miles of these mammals migrating underwater. And again, like, you can't calculate the effects of these, because if something if a whale's beached 100 miles away, the Navy could just be like, well, plausible deniability. We have no idea if that was a result of these sonar blasts or not. And again, the crushing of coral reefs, all fish underwater live basically by sound. And so this sonar blasting, again, like, it just has an incredible impact that we will not know, because no one is doing correct environmental assessments of this, certainly not the Navy.
I want to expand this just a bit, because you're talking basically about the U.S. military just trashing the environment, which is what it does. And it kind of speaks to the theme of the conversations we've been having throughout this episode, speaking with indigenous communities who are dealing with like pipelines and just the government like trashing their rights and trashing their land. And of course, you were in Hawaii for this, which has, in Pearl Harbor, which has like a whole other story. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit about the significance of that as kind of like a microcosm of the sort of destructive nature of the U.S. military. Because, Mike Preisner, who's also involved in this project as well, I've spoken to him before about this, and I was actually kind of blown away with what he had to say about what Pearl Harbor was like before it was a military base for the U.S., and then after, and just the damage and destruction that's caused, and just the broader context of the destruction of Hawaii and of the indigenous communities that live there, so the U.S. can have this base in the Pacific.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so many indigenous Hawaiians, so many indigenous people in general have such a important understanding and philosophy about working with the environment. And so it's just such a violation of that law of nature, that you have this reciprocal relationship with the environment, you respect the land, you give back to the land. And it's just it's just such a huge detachment from what the military is doing. They call it militarism, because, we're told as Americans growing up our whole lives that this is paradise and we go there for vacation. And there's this huge, underbelly that's very hidden. It's a very disturbing, dark reality that exists across Hawaii, especially in Oahu, which is 25% occupied by the U.S. military. They consider the entire Hawaiian Islands an illegal occupation, because it was never, there's all of these, basically they go back to the illegal seizure of Hawaii and how it was against international law, and they still want to take back their cultural heritage and say that they're not American. And it's just something that I never learned in school, especially when you're looking at Pearl Harbor, right? Pearl Harbor is called Pearl Harbor because of the literal pearls. Like, it was overabundant with oysters and mussels and all this beautiful fish. You just go with like a basket. It was the bread basket of the entire land. Everyone got their fish from there, fisheries, and it was just incredible. And the fact that the U.S. military came in and just dredged up the entirety of Pearl Harbor and dumped a toxic slew of chemicals there, remnants from World War II, from Vietnam, because Pearl Harbor was basically used as a launching pad for all of these wars and never cleaned up properly. And so ever since then, it's just hundreds of polluted sites. There's entire islands that are completely uninhabitable off the coast of Hawaii that are still within the Hawaiian island chain. that are just destroyed from munitions testings. And so that is the reality. That is the sad, dark reality there. And indigenous people have been fighting and resisting against U.S. militarism, especially the appendage of RIMPAC for decades, being like, look, this causes an untold environmental impact to our islands, and it's just an extension of the imperialism that has destroyed and continues to hold us hostage on this island. The amphibious land exercises that they do as part of RIMPAC, I think, really says it all about the environmental toll on the actual shores. Because, when I was flying into Hawaii, I thought it was a pretty interesting dichotomy, these public service announcements on the plane that were just like, don't wear certain types of sunscreen in the ocean. Like, everyone has to do their part to not, destroy the environment. And then meanwhile, RIMPAC is going on, they're blowing up ships, they're launching all this shit everywhere. They're like bringing these like assault vehicles on top of the sand where turtles hatch their babies. And for basically the only time that turtles have been able to come back, because RIMPAC says they're environmental stewards, right? They have like repositioned their whole rhetoric to be like, no, we work with the environment because of all these lawsuits and outcry over the last 20 years about the environmental impact of these games. Now they're like, no. We actually look out for whales and dolphins. We work with the land. We help the land by moving these giant assault vehicles to do mock invasions of residential neighborhoods on top of these islands. And indigenous activists were just like, no, actually, turtles came back and hatched their babies for the first time when RIMPAC during COVID was just out in the sea and didn't do these amphibious land invasions. So I think that really says it all about what the truth is. And who knows how many other mammals or animals are impacted by that. But I just thought, these are endangered species. And everyone is told when they're flying into there, don't touch the turtles. They're incredible, these ancient species that we're just supposed to leave alone. Well, what the hell is the military doing to impede their ability to survive? It's just absolutely, the disconnect is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's bonkers. I mean, and even just listening to some of your podcast about their attempted greenwashing and crazy press handling, in and of itself, unbelievable. But I do want to say that, but I don't want to bury the lead on this because, believe it or not, kids, the Empire Files is not being funded by, sort of random billionaires out there. And I know you guys have been traveling all over to get stuff for this real reporting on what the military is doing. So where can people go? Where can they support you? How can they support the doc and everything else you're doing?
Absolutely. So this is part of just the basically the oceanic empire, all these islands in the Pacific Ocean. Guam, Okinawa is essentially a neo-colony. Hawaii is an essential part of the story. And we're going to all of these places to tie this all together because there's a lot of detached, disparate reporting that doesn't tell the whole story about how destructive the United States military really is and how we really need to confront the elephant in the room here if we want real core change to deal with the environment. People can go to earthsgreatestenemy.com. Please donate because this is all grassroots funded, no Peter Thiel money, no billionaire money coming into this project. And it's going to be really hard to get out there because we know people do not want to address the truth. And the military, people are very indoctrinated with patriotism in this country. So we really need to get the word out there so we can change the consciousness.
Yeah, well, I think this is going to be an awesome project. I've been hyped for it since the first trailer came out. We got you can see there the website. Hopefully everyone goes. We'll try to get that up on our social media as well. But Abby Martin of the Empire Files, as always, very honored to be joined by you. And thank you so much for giving us some of your time.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Peace.
Anytime.